this expansion of Islam soon after his death, and many of the ancient Christian places are overrun and conquered by the Muslims. Syria as a whole falls to Islamic armies by the year 635, only 3 years after Muhammad's death. Antioch and Persia are also conquered in 637. Egypt, that ancient Christian area that we've talked about, where monasticism arose. We had the great bishop St. Athanasius from Egypt, St. Anthony the Abbot, St. Pachomius, all these great saints in the history of the church came from Egypt. It was conquered by the Muslims in 642. Jerusalem, the holy city, falls to an Islamic army in 638. The last Christian stronghold in North Africa is conquered by the Muslims in the year 700. They cross the Straits of Gibraltar in 704 and go into Spain, and by 711 they've conquered the entire Iberian Peninsula. So all these ancient Christian areas, the whole Holy Land, all of North Africa, up into Spain now, has been conquered. Now there's outposts, the Christian outposts that still exist in Spain, and the Spaniards and the Christians who live there will continue to fight the Muslims in one of the, if not the longest war in the history of the world. A 770-year conflict of the Reconquista to reclaim their land from the Muslims. And it doesn't happen until the year 1492, when the last Muslim stronghold is forced out in Granada under the rule of Fernando and Isabel. Now they cross the Pyrenees from Spain and they venture forth into France. And ultimately they get to the city, or the little town of Poitiers in the year 732. And the little town of Poitiers is about 120 miles southwest of Paris. So they are a 2-hour drive from the city of Paris. This Muslim army is campaigning in France. And they meet an important person in the history of Western civilization, a Frankish individual by the name of Charles Martel. And Charles leads his Frankish armor, or his armored cavalry and his troops into battle against the Muslims, and he defeats them at the great Battle of Poitiers in the year 732. Now Charles actually, his name was Charles, but after this battle, he was referred to always as Charles Martel, because the word martel means hammer in French. So he became Charles the Hammer after his defeat of this Islamic army in the Battle of Poitiers. Now this is an important event in our history and understanding Western civilization, understanding the history of the church, because had Charles not defeated that Muslim army 2-hour drive southwest of Paris, then there's no telling where the Muslims would have stopped. They easily could have conquered all of France, they could have marched into what is modern-day Germany, and even gone down into Italy, and even been successful in conquering all these areas. You and I, today, if Charles, that Frankish warrior, had not stopped this advance, might not even be speaking in English. We might be speaking Arabic right now. So this is important for us. This is one of those very important events to understand church history. To understand that what happens in the past informs the present and then shapes the future as well. It's very important for us to understand this period of time. Now the Muslims also continued their raiding throughout, although they were stopped in France, they continued their raiding throughout the Mediterranean. They invaded Sicily in 831. They actually invaded Italy, the mainland, in 841. Several years after that, they actually raided Rome, the great eternal city. 1,000 troops landed at Ostia, which is a small port town not very near Rome. They marched into Rome, they plundered the city, they even took items out of the churches of St. Peter and St. Paul. Pope Leo IV actually organized the defenses of the city after this event and constructed these defensive walls, many of which still exist, or remnants of them exist in Rome today. They're known as the Leonine walls. You can go to Rome and see them. In 884, they burned the great Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino. And they were finally defeated and kicked out of mainland Italy later in 916 by Pope John X. Pope John X gathered an army together and personally led this army into battle against the Muslims. Now what was life like in these conquered territories? Non-Muslims had very, very little rights. They were treated barely above slaves. Every Jew or Christian in a conquered territory had to pay a tax to the Muslim rulers to be left alone, basically. And this tax was very burdensome, and everyone had to pay it. Women, children, and even the dead. If someone died in your family, you had a dead member in your family, you had to pay the tax to the Muslim rulers. They outlawed Christians from being able to carry weapons. You couldn't ring church bells. They placed restrictions on building and restoring churches, synagogues, and temples. If you were a Christian or a Jew, you couldn't testify in court, and you had to wear special clothes with an identifying marker labeling you either as a Jew or a Christian. Now, there was heavy pressure to convert. Now, it is true, and you hear this sometimes, written or said in our modern world, that the Muslims didn't go in and force people to convert. In many cases, that is true. But what happened was they established a society that was only favorable towards Muslims. So there was heavy societal pressure to convert, and unfortunately, most people in these conquered ancient Christian lands did end up converting to Islam. In Egypt, in the late 7th century, the Muslim ruler there passed an edict which said every publicly visible cross was to be destroyed. And every Christian church had to have this sign placed on it. Muhammad is the great apostle of God, and Jesus also is the apostle of God, but truly God is not begotten and does not beget. So an attack against the central doctrine of our faith, the incarnation of Jesus Christ, true God and true man. So Islam, as we see, has greatly impacted the church, has taken over a lot of ancient Christian lands, and as we continue our story of missionaries and emperor in our next session, we'll look at some heresies that arise in the church during this time, and we'll see the second part of our time period of missionaries and emperor. We'll talk about and discuss the great emperor Charlemagne when we come back in our next session.
So, a lot of interesting information in this lesson. So what I'll do, since obviously there are no groups here, I will go through some questions. We've got 6 questions for this particular lesson, and go through the questions as well as what we have for the answers, and we can, I'll discuss a little bit of this, and if you're following at home and you have your book, you can go through. You can either stop it and answer them yourselves, or just watch it all the way through. Think about some of the notes that you took and what you heard, and see if you can add to any of what's in here. So the notes, the response answers are on page 133 in your book. And so I'll start with question number 1. Why is Saint Benedict known as the father of Western monasticism? Explain in your own words his vision of monasticism. So, we know from the lesson material that he's not the first monk in church history, but he was very influential. So, he's known as the father of Western monasticism because he established the rule that would become the foundation for all monasteries in the Western Church. His rule transformed loose and scattered associations of pious Christians into focused, organized, and unified groups that brought great strength to the Church and helped preserve the invaluable written treasures of the ancient world, most especially the Bible. So basically there was loose confederations of hermits, monks, whatnot, and he organized them into communities. And so that was kind of a revolutionary concept at the time. A monk's life should consist of work, prayer, study, self-denial, and, as appropriate, fasting. However, Benedictine monks did not practice extreme poverty, and the rule guaranteed that all basic needs should be met. A monk should imitate the life of Christ by being devoted to chastity, temperance, and obedience. A monk should spend his life in service to others and be especially concerned with preserving the sacred scriptures. So a lot of what their tasks were copying the scriptures. That way there would be copies of them, and they could spread those throughout the known Christian world. And then an abbot, elected from among the community for life, should lead the monks. The abbot served as a father figure for the community and would exercise his ministry an imitation of Christ's servant leadership. So that's essentially what St. Benedict did. He organized them, gave them a structure, and gave them a purpose. Question number 2. Pope St. Gregory I is another of the few popes to be awarded the title of Great. What were some of his achievements? Does he share anything in common with Pope Leo the Great? So, as the head of the Catholic Church, Pope St. Gregory removed and he disciplined corrupt clergy. He enforced priestly celibacy, and he defended the church from heresies. He also rebuked John the Faster, Patriarch of Constantinople, when he usurped the title of Ecumenical Patriarch. And he ensured the conversion of Britain. He also revitalized the liturgy. He preserved the tombs of the saints, and he wrote several major theological works, as well as over 800 letters. As the chief civil administrator of Rome, he fended off the Lombards, sometimes by bribes and other times by force. He established hospitals and orphanages. He rebuilt many of the great buildings, protected Jews from persecution, and organized the distribution of food to the poor. Although their pontificates were more than 100 years apart, there are several striking similarities between St. Gregory the Great and St. Leo the Great. Both defended Rome from invasion. Both rigorously reformed the church, fought heresies, and enforced the authority of the Pope over the Eastern Church. So there were quite a few similarities. They were both quite influential theologically, spiritually, as well as politically in their day. So it sums up with, perhaps most significantly, both changed the way in which the world viewed the papacy, with St. Leo showing pagans that it was the vicar of Christ that saved them from doom, and St. Gregory showing that a pope could provide for the physical as well as spiritual needs of the people. All right, question number 3. Despite the many difficulties of this time period, missionary activity thrived. Who were some of the great missionaries that conquered hearts for Christ? What procedures did they follow in bringing the light of Christ to others? So the lesson talked about several of them. First was St. Augustine of Canterbury. He was very influential, of course. He was the head missionary sent by Pope St. Gregory the Great to convert the Anglos in Britain. And he landed in England in 597, and he met with King Ethelbert of Kent, who was very receptive to the faith. The missionaries made such quick progress that there were 10,000 baptisms on Christmas Day of that same year. So they were quite receptive. That was much different than some of the experiences of missionaries that were spread throughout the empire. We'll talk about some of those in future lessons as well. In the 6th century, Irish monk monasteries such as St. Columba and St. Brendan sailed to Scotland, Wales, Brittany, Iceland, and possibly even America, spreading the faith and bringing people into the church. Pope St. Gregory the Great provided guidance to St. Augustine on how to deal with certain issues with evangelizing pagans. This guidance centered on respecting the sacred places, customs, and festivals of the pagans. Christian missionaries were instructed to accommodate these customs and festivals as long as they did not contradict the faith. Additionally, they reused pagan worship sites, now consecrated to the one true God. Pope St. Gregory the Great recognized the authentic conversion requires time and effort that cannot be forced. The basic procedures outlined by Pope St. Gregory shaped Catholic missionary efforts throughout the church. And so, we see that in a lot of the customs, a lot of the things that they were doing, the pagans, in those times. It's hard for people to turn completely away from what they know, what's comfortable to them. And so, we see things like the Christmas tree. Well, that is something that we could absorb and bring into the church. So as opposed to going and destroying all of their sites and destroying all of their cultural references to their previous religion, what we can do is we can take those things and we can integrate them in and have them become part of our worship experience. And so that helps them to come along. And it's quite different than the experience of, say, for example, those who were persecuted by Islam, where Islam came in, and if you did not follow the tenets of Islam, you were made a second-class citizen, and it was quite difficult. What the Christian missionaries did is they went out, they evangelized, and brought those people in a way that made them feel comfortable. So that's why they were so successful at what they were doing and why they didn't have to conquer by the sword. Okay, so the next question, let's see, we've got question number 4. One way to learn about a religion is to learn about its founder. If someone wants to understand the Christian faith, he must obviously study the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, just as he would have to study about Buddha in order to learn about Buddhism. What has learning about the life of Muhammad taught you about Islam? Now, obviously everyone is going to have a different perspective on this, but we have some thoughts in the book, and I'll go through a few of those, and you can think about them yourself and think about from your own experiences what you get out of this. But Muhammad received his first revelations, quote unquote, in 610 AD, and he initially believed he was possessed by evil spirits and even contemplated suicide. In 624, Muhammad led his followers to attack a caravan during the pagan holy month, in which it was forbidden to shed blood. He explained his actions by way of a revelation justifying the attack. Muhammad was a militant warrior who personally engaged in 27 battles. So he was quite prolific in the war area. He also had 14 wives. His favorite was 9 years old, and he married her when she was 6 and he was in his 50s. He took his own daughter-in-law as a wife after he received a revelation explaining that it was all his will. And he was merciful to those who opposed him. He ordered assassinations on political and personal opponents, including the mother of 5, who had written unfavorable things about him. So not a person you would want to cross for sure. He ordered the beheading of over 500 Jews in Medina on trumped-up charges of collaboration with the Meccans, who were besieging Medina. And he showed great contempt for the Jewish people. He claimed revelations from Allah that justify the expulsion and killing of all Jews. He's recorded as saying, "The last hour would not come until the Muslims will fight against the Jews, and the Muslims would kill them until the Jews would hide themselves behind a stone or a tree, and a stone or a tree would say, 'Muslim, or the servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him.'" Muhammad died in 632 AD. In his farewell address, he told his followers to fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah. So, quite a different perspective than Christianity. What was the life of a non-Muslim like in areas that had been conquered by Islam? We know that it was very difficult. You were made a second-class citizen. You may not have been forced to convert, but you certainly would be ridiculed. You would not have any political power. You would not have the life that a Muslim would have. And so you wouldn't be allowed to give testimony in court. You would not be allowed to freely associate, and there were a lot of restrictions on the life that you lived. And question number 6, what happened to Muhammad's followers after his death? How does this compare with the story of early Christians? Following Muhammad's final command to fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah, the early Muslims, through a series of savage victories, conquered Syria in 635, Persia in 637, Jerusalem in 638, Egypt in 642, and all of North America by the year 700. The entire Iberian Peninsula of Spain by 711, and they had infiltrated Gaul to within 120 miles of Paris by 732. Muslim armies even raided the Italian mainland and plundered Rome in 846. They burned St. Benedict's historic monastery at Monte Cassino in 884 and had conquered Sicily in 878. Their forays into Italy were not stopped until the early 10th century when Pope John X led an army against them and secured a great victory. So, the early church struggled with what to do with Islam coming at them. The church did not want to conquer by the sword. It never intended to. And since Islam did, it took a lot of adjustment. And we'll see that coming up in future lessons when we get into the Crusades, how the church responded. But obviously, Islam was a very large opponent and something that they had to take seriously. So it really made them rethink how to address those who would conquer by the sword. So that's the lesson for now.